Bret was educated in college at the University of Chicago, where he was smart enough to read some important books and lucky enough to read them with some great teachers, including Leon Kass and others. He quickly emerged as an interesting young journalist in mind, working at commentary, working at the international editions of the Wall Street Journal, and at 28 became the editor-in-chief of the Jerusalem Post. After that, he was recruited back to the Wall Street Journal, and for a number of years has been their foreign affairs columnist, is now the deputy editorial page editor, and all joking aside, won in 2013 the Pulitzer Prize for commentary. A little while ago, he published an important article in commentary on the new disorder in world affairs, which is now on the verge of becoming an important book about America's retreat. And first, I want to welcome you, Bret, before we plunge into the topic. Thanks for being here. It's great to have you. Don't clap too early. You don't know what he's going to say.
That's well said.
Let's just start with the heart of the book and the heart of the argument. What's the case that America is in a new retreat, and what's the evidence for that argument?
Well, Eric, thank you for having me here. I have to say that my appearances with Tikvah are always of a different order than my appearances at many other events. For one thing, I'm typically more afraid of my audience at Tikvah, not because they're unfriendly, but because they are intellectually very serious. Also, Tikvah has a way of pairing me with sort of really the great minds of the day, not like me, the faux great minds of the day, but Moshe Halbertal and last year in this room, Michael Walzer. So I feel comparatively at ease next to you.
I don't know whether to take that as a compliment or an insult, but I'll take it as a compliment.
So this book, as you said, began thanks largely to John Podhoretz as an article in commentary called The Coming Global Disorder. And at the time, which was in the summer of 2012 that I was working on this article, I began to sort of look around the world, and what struck me most forcefully was the fact that everywhere you looked, you saw in the West and in the sort of the traditional strongholds of liberal, what you might call liberal democracy, you saw a tremendous amount of weakness, and the weakness wasn't just cyclical. It seemed to me secular and systemic. And when you looked to the more aggressive regimes, whether it's North Korea, Iran, China, or Russia, they seem to be taking advantage of the weakness of their enemy, that is to say, us. Europe's problems, very early on, it became clear, were not problems that you ordinarily associate with the problems of a recession. They weren't economic problems, and actually they weren't even political problems, although they are economic and political problems. In a sense, they are civilizational problems. The very essence of the European idea, as it's been articulated and developed over the last 60-odd years, ever since, I guess, maybe less than 60, the Treaty of Rome in the late 1950s, the development of European institutions, seemed to me to be coming asunder in a very dangerous way, and in a way that, in a sense, would only repair itself at the point of a catastrophic breach. Now, one of the interesting things about the United States is that we have a way, as imperfect as it is, of evolving politically, economically, and socially. Europe, by contrast, seems to go from catastrophe to catastrophe, interspersed with periods of cultural and ideological stasis. And I have the sense, I mean, if you ask me what part of the world really worries you the most, I think if I were going to offer a really serious, considered answer, it wouldn't be the Middle East, it would actually be Europe. I don't see Europe emerging from this crisis anytime soon and in any good way. Then you look over to the Asian periphery, that is to say South Korea, Japan, Philippines, Indonesia, Thailand. And there, too, you saw a lot of weakness, and a lot of the weakness was more than simply, again, economic or political. It was cultural and civilizational. take the case of Japan, which when I was growing up in the 1980s seemed, to be the next, as they called it, the rising sun, the country that was going to dominate the 21st century. And a lot of silly books were written by Harvard professors, and you know them well. I mean, Ezra Vogel wrote one of the books. Then that idiot at the Atlantic, Jim Fallows, wrote another one. I'm very ad hominem, by the way. All talking about how Japan had sort of mastered economic processes in a way that were much that were superior to the kind of laissez-faire, so-called laissez-faire American attitudes. Now what you see in Japan is that what once were their virtues have all become vices. I mean, the manic corporate loyalty that once was chalked up as a great strength of the Japanese economy actually turns out to be a terrific weakness. The close relationships between government bureaucracies, corporations, and political parties, that's another source of systemic weakness because it favors champion industries at the expense of innovators and entrepreneurs. So the problems of Japan, all of this compounded by things like demography, with which you're familiar with, those two struck me as fundamental. The Arab world, by the way, of course, was another reason why I was thinking about global disorder, because there too the problem wasn't just, you'd had corrupt autocratic regimes like Assad and Mubarak and Ben Ali in Tunisia. There too the problem is what I call civilizational. It was that complex of cultural attitudes, political institutions, familial patterns and ways, all of them coming together to create really a giant failed civilization. That's why, unlike, to be ad hominem again, Tom Friedman and Nick Kristof, I was a skeptic of the Arab Spring from the moment that the protesters arrived in Tahrir Square, and I feel that my skepticism has been well borne out. So looking around the world, basically, you saw that all the traditional engines of global growth and of stability were coming apart. And at the same time, I was mindful of things that were happening in little out-of-the-way places like Woody Island in the South China Sea, the Senkaku Island issue, which I was aware of very early on. All of them, it struck me as early warning signals of global disorder. When you read Churchill's wonderful history of the First World War, he really begins in a place called Agadir, which is this tiny port on what is now the Moroccan coast, practically the Western Sahara. It's a little out-of-the-way blip of a place where in July of 1911, a German gunship showed up, called the Panther, and all of Germany went nuts, went wild. They called it the Panthersprung or something like that, the Panther's leap, celebrating this diplomatic, geopolitical move by Germany. And it's a reminder that often the signals of major instability come in little out-of-the-way places that you haven't previously heard of. So when the Senkaku Island issue became a salient issue in Japanese-Chinese relations, you understood that something deeper was afoot than simply a dispute over an uninhabited little island, the size of, Governor's Island or something like that. So amid systemic weakness, particularly systemic Western weakness, and of course that weakness is also well pronounced in many respects in the United States, all of a sudden what you call, or political scientists call, the revisionist regimes were sensing opportunities to revise their regional order, their regional situation in a way that met their interests. So this was in 2011, 2012 that I started thinking about this. And what do we have in the intervening 18 months? Well, we have Iran on the cusp of becoming a nuclear weapons state. That's really where it is. And the complete collapse of the American position. You have Syria having used chemical weapons with no consequences. You have the Russian move into the Crimea. I was just in the Crimea a few months ago. This was predictable, and yet the United States seems to have been taken totally by surprise. The Chinese are making incredibly aggressive and assertive claims to the South China Sea, which is important because the South China Sea sits on one of the world's largest energy deposits in the world. Now, what is the situation reminiscent of? And I'm keeping my answers brief here, Eric. What is this reminiscent of? Well, since it's 1914, everyone is talking about the lessons of 1914, and there are a lot of lessons from 1914. A lot of books. There's an excellent book called The Sleepwalkers, which very interesting history of how the world stumbled into the First World War. I actually think the opposite historical analogy is the interwar period, the 1920s and the 1930s. That was also a period in which the great liberal powers of the day, namely France, Britain, and the United States, each decided for their own reasons that they were either unwilling or incapable of policing the world order that they had brought into being at the Versailles Conference in 1919. The French didn't have the means, the United States didn't have the will, and Britain was somewhere not just geographically but also ideologically in between. So the moment that Germany, the Soviet Union, fascist Italy, and Japan sensed this weakness on the part of the traditional guarantors of global political order, they began to take advantage of that weakness. And it began, it began at the Rapallo conference in the early 1920s when Germany and the Soviet Union effectively started becoming allies or military allies. And it extended its way through the invasion of Manchuria and invasion of Abyssinia, and then, of course, the Sudetenland. Now we're talking a lot about the Sudetenland analogies because they're so reminiscent. This, what's just happened is, Crimea as the Sudetenland is a pretty good, gives you a pretty good sense of where we are. I don't know if it's 1938 per se, but we're somewhere in those years. Final point that I want to make, and this is also part of the subtitle of my book, we're entering into a period of not just in the United States, period of what I call a new isolationism. And whenever you say so to tell someone, your thinking is isolationist, they start screaming and yelling, and they equate it with a kind of anti-Semitism. But isolationism is a deep strain in American political thinking. I mean, George Washington's farewell address, Thomas Jefferson's first inaugural address, John Quincy Adams's famous Independence Day address from 1825, all strike these deeply isolationist chords to say that America's role in the world is to be a city upon a hill, but not to be a crusader state, not to go around, as Quincy Adams put it, in search of monsters to destroy. Now this, once again, is an ideology that's becoming very much in vogue in both parties. You have a president of the United States saying that the only nation that he's interested in building is this nation. He talks about nation building at home. And quite frankly, probably the most formidable political contender among Republicans going into 2016 is a guy called Rand Paul, who is sounding very similar themes. Rand Paul Barack Obama wants America to retreat from its global commitments in Iraq, Afghanistan, elsewhere in the world for the sake of bigger government, and Rand Paul wants the United States to retreat for the sake of smaller government. So the mentality that existed, also a bipartisan mentality in the 1920s and 1930s, is becoming a very entrenched mentality today. There was this Pew survey that came out a few months ago pointing out that some astonishing percentage of Americans, I forgot the exact number, think that America should mind its business in world affairs. It's its highest rate in the post-World War II era. So unless there is a genuine intellectual and political effort to explain why the new isolationism is as bad for the United States and as bad for the world as the old isolationism, we are going to slip back into what I think were tragic tragic patterns in American policy and in global politics. So that's the whole point of this book. And I took a little too long to explain.
So if America's retreat is a choice, a political and cultural choice being made by the United States, can you say more why you think we're making that choice and what the consequences of it are for America first and then for the world?
Well, ostensibly, the idea is that we're tired of war. And we've bankrupted ourselves fighting foreign wars that frankly didn't yield a great deal. I'm just repeating a cliche, but it's worth kind of examining that cliche. Between 2002, roughly the beginning of the Afghan war, and 2012, so for that decade, the federal government spent well in excess of $30 trillion. Most of it went to Social Security checks, Medicare costs, other entitlements. the wars in Iraq itself, the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, cost a little more than $1 trillion. Barack Obama spent more money in a single day when he signed the $787 billion stimulus bill in February of 2009 than we spent in the entire Iraq war. So one can have an intelligent argument about whether the federal government is overspending, but you cannot have an intelligent argument on the subject of whether we have bankrupted ourselves in foreign wars. Nonetheless, this case is often made, and it's quite powerful, and it feeds into everyone who looks at the Pentagon as a useful kitty from which to fund preferred domestic programs. Second concept is this idea that we are fatigued by war. Now, any American who grew up during World War II probably knew someone, a cousin, a brother, a sibling, an uncle, who died in the war. Hundreds of Americans, something like 435 Americans a day, were being killed in 1944 and 1945, all the way up until the Japanese surrender effectively in August of 1945. Very few Americans will actually, I would be astonished if someone in this room, perhaps someone in this room knows someone who was killed in Iraq or Afghanistan, or could claim anything other than a kind of second order connection. But again, that point is being made very powerfully that this war has just exhausted us, and it's made us tired of the rest of the world. We are kind of talking ourselves histrionically into the notion that we have spent a decade overly engaged in the world, and now it's time for nation building at home. I mean, Richard Haass, the president of the Council on Foreign Relations, has effectively written a book that's essence is isolationist. Let's focus more on the home front. And fundamentally, Eric, the deep problem with that thinking is that it imagines that foreign policy and domestic policy are a zero-sum game. That is to say, the effort and the money that we expend abroad is somehow taken away from what we have available at home. Now, what the people who constructed the post-World War II order understood, and understood because they'd learned the lessons of isolationism. I'm talking about Arthur Vandenberg on the Republican side, and Dean Acheson, and Harry Truman, and George Marshall, and all these people who were the founders of the post-war order understood profoundly that domestic and foreign policy are not a zero-sum game. That ultimately, global security is in the deep political and economic interests of the United States. We are stronger when Europe is strong, when Japan is strong. We are stronger when the world outside our borders is not a chaos. That's what they got. That's the central insight that says that no, as a matter of fact, we want a world that is conducive to democracy, to free trade, to a broader prosperity, a world that is not going to lead to chaos and tragedy. Now, it would be nice to imagine that that could be a self-policing world, either through a balance of power or through the mechanisms of the United Nations or something else. But what we also know is that the only way such a world is sustained is by the exercise and the certainty of American power. We are not exercising that power, and other countries are becoming increasingly doubtful about the certainty of it. I'll stop there.
So is our situation, as you see it, fundamentally different from Europe? Meaning, is our retreat an inevitable fact, or it's still a choice that could be reversed? And is retreat the same as decline, or are these different phenomena?
This is an excellent question. So one of the arguments I make in this book is that the United States is not in decline. Although retreat, taken to its logical conclusion, can lead to decline. Europe, in my view, is in decline. Europe has been in decline for a very long time, and that decline is accelerating and becoming visible in very disturbing ways. Decline is something that happens almost beyond the reach of politics to remedy or to reverse the decline. Retreat is a matter of choice. And when you think of, people talk about America in decline a lot, and they also, by the way, talk about America's supposed decline as a way of justifying retreat. To say we're a country in decline, therefore we have to pull back. Think about the three most consequential inventions of the last 10 years, let's say. What would I say they are? I would say, number one, it's social media. I mean, this has unlocked literally trillions of dollars in economic potential. I mean, it's revolutionary what has happened. To think, everyone here who's a Tikvah fellow kind of has taken Facebook and all of this sort of for granted, these methods of communicating seamlessly with dozens of people around the world all the time, didn't exist until some schnook from Harvard invented it. This is an American invention, and by the way, it only could have been an American invention. It is literally inconceivable, and I'm sure I'm insulting someone, that Facebook could have been invented in France. For a variety of reasons.
I've lost track of your insults over the years, Bret. We're used to it by now.
All right. No, it's one of the sad facts about France, that it's just impossible to imagine Facebook happening in France. There's a lively Facebook in Pakistan, but it's faceless book.
What are two and three?
So number two, of course, is fracking. I was just reading. Here's another ad hominem. I was just reading this brilliant column from 2010 by Paul Krugman, my favorite columnist, and Paul Krugman says, "Look, basically, we've reached peak oil. And energy prices are just going to go up because demand keeps going up, and there's just not enough supply." And then he has this wonderful line like, "And by the way, America has nothing to do with it. Look up, just Google when you go home. Google Paul Krugman peak oil 2010. It's one of those columns. It's like so delicious. It's like a Shake Shack burger. You're like, oh, it's so good because it's so perfectly wrong. It's like one of those 4,000 calorie mushroom situations." It's Krugman peak oil 2010. Put it that way. That will almost certainly get you the column. So in 2010, genius Nobel Prize winners like Paul Krugman. My next prize will be a Nobel, and then you'll know I'm really worthless.
Then you'll really be late.
So he makes this prediction, and in fact, what we learn is that in 2 years, the United States is going to become the world's leading energy producer, oil as well as natural gas. This is an astonishing fact with revolutionary economic and geopolitical implications. It's going to revive American manufacturing because the cost, when you factor in energy and transportation costs, it's suddenly going to become economical despite higher labor costs to start producing in Ohio as opposed to, Guangzhou or something. It is going to have major implications for how we deal with other nations. I mean, for instance, we just took 1 million barrels of Iranian oil, off the market, at least until John Kerry had other ideas. But for a year or two, we had 1 million barrels off the market, and it had no effect on the price of oil. This is also, one of the effects of the fracking revolution. And again, by the way, fracking is something literally that could only happen in the United States. And I can explain that in a moment. Okay. And the third thing I would say, and this maybe is peculiar to my personal industry, which is newspapers, is the invention of tablets by Apple. Basically, the everything revolution. It's just fundamentally transforming the way in which we carry media and have access to media and the places from which we have access to media. And this, again, unlocks trillions of dollars of value. So these are three, you think of, what are the three most consequential inventions of the last decade? They're all made in America. And by the way, you go back decade after decade after decade, and you see this. So the notion of American decline seems to me fundamentally misjudged. This country has an ability to adapt and renew itself in a way that is almost unique in the world and really kind of astonishing. Nonetheless, we've talked ourselves into this idea that we're in decline, and so therefore we have to be in retreat. In fact, we're putting forward an idea of retreat and retroactively justifying it with this idea that we have to be in decline. We weren't a country in decline even in the 1970s, which were much worse than this decade is. I mean, when you think of all the great sources of American renewal, so many of them came out of this dreadful decade called the 1970s. And good things will come out of this decade if we can just get over it, or at least this administration.
So what's the alternative strategy? Meaning, if you were the Machiavellian prince to this president and he were willing to listen to you, what's the alternative to American retreat? And what does it actually mean in some of the concrete policy world order challenges that we face? Russia, Syria, Iran.
You know, so how did New York, I've been thinking about this since de Blasio became mayor. Because in a way it mirrors, I remember, young as I am, I well remember New York in the 1980s. And in fact, when I first moved to New York, I lived on the Upper West Side. And there was this crazy man who basically had staked out, you know, on Broadway, the island in the middle of Broadway, he had staked out a corner on 100th and Broadway, and right where the Metro Diner is, for those of you who are Upper West Siders. I used to live there, and I ate at the Metro Diner like twice or if not 3 times a day. And he was this crazy lunatic, and he just sort of lived on the Broadway island of Broadway and 100th. And you always had to time your crossings. If you weren't on the other side, you had to be sure that you had enough time to get all the way across Broadway so that you wouldn't be stuck on the island with crazy dude who might stab you with some AIDS-infected hypodermic syringe. I mean, it was one of these creep-out situations that you never really encounter these days. But it was ubiquitous in New York City, or driving to New York City, the squeegee man, all the rest of it. And so what was the problem? There was the appearance of disorder everywhere. And it's what James Q. Wilson brilliantly diagnosed as the broken windows phenomenon, where the visible evidence of disorder encouraged deeper forms of disorder. So the best way of policing the city, Wilson suggested, wasn't going after root causes of crime, like dealing with poverty and oppression and sexual dysfunction or whatever. It was cleaning the streets, making sure that young kids weren't jumping turnstiles in the subway, cleaning up the subway so that people wouldn't, getting rid of the graffiti, that people wouldn't feel just sort of disgusted being on the subway, getting rid of the squeegee men, just looking at their arrest records, going after people who urinated on the streets. All these things that, in and of themselves, okay, are not major crimes, actually all added up to radically cleaning up the city, so that a city that had more than 2,000 murders in 1990, okay, now had fewer than 400 murders in the last year of the Bloomberg administration. I think we're about to go back up the sine curve there, but so that was a view of how to police a city that worked. I would suggest that there is something to be said similarly with policing global order. Small efforts to disturb global order, whether it is China's repeated aggressions in the Senkaku Islands, or its harassment of American ships in South China, or Syria's use of chemical weapons, all of these have to be stopped, and stopped very decisively at a very early stage. Because at a certain point, those minor instances of disorder become major instances. People have said all these, the geniuses of the liberal intelligentsia keep saying what Obama did in Syria has nothing to do with what Putin did in Crimea. And my response to that is that what's at issue isn't really a cause and effect situation. There's an environment. There is an environment in which Putin looks at an American president who won't stand up to his own red lines in a rather trivial, geopolitically trivial situation like Syria, and thinks, I can get away with taking Crimea. And by the way, the Iranians think that as well. How is it conceivable that the United States will be serious about preventing Iran from getting a nuclear weapon, which is a tough case, when it's not serious about Syria using chemical weapons, which is an easy case? We could have destroyed all Syrian airfields without having a single plane actually overfly Syrian territory. The Israelis routinely destroy Syrian munitions from planes that are overflying Lebanon or overflying the Mediterranean Sea. You can do this with standoff weapons, but if you're not willing to police the small stuff, you're going to find much greater disorder. By the way, I should say that unless you do this now, Mitt Romney had amazingly a good op-ed in the Wall Street Journal the other day, and he quoted that wonderful line in Shakespeare about the talking about there are times when you can go out with the tide, and there are times when you can't. I just forgot the line, so that's why I'm not quoting it. Tides in the affairs of men. There was a moment when Syria was a doable proposition for the United States. We did nothing, and now it becomes increasingly difficult to envision a set of options which are attractive to us. I would still say, if you were to ask me, if you're the President of the United States, what would you do about Syria? I'd say I'd kill Assad right away. And these days, incidentally, I'm pro-Al-Qaeda. You'll be happy to know. Since this is on the record, I'll explain that in a moment. But if you allow global disorder to reach a certain critical mass, and I don't know where that critical mass is, there is no going back. You have to, in effect, enter a kind of a catastrophe to pick yourself out of it.
I'll let you explain the Al-Qaeda comment, but then I'd like to zero in for a minute on Russia. Meaning, if America were still serious about the world order business, how would we handle the Russia situation right now?
Briefly on Al-Qaeda. Al-Qaeda is incapable of governing. Everywhere, Al-Qaeda has never really been able to govern anything except little provinces for discrete periods of time. It's Al-Qaeda, if you take an example from virology, for instance, the Ebola virus is a terrible virus that will kill you in a matter of days, should you be so unfortunate to contract it. But Ebola never takes hold in a wide population because it burns itself out. It kills its victims so quickly that the virus doesn't have a lot of time to spread. One of the reasons why HIV was so deadly is that the virus could incubate and spread far and wide before it killed you. So if you can walk around with HIV for 10 years, you can infect a lot of people, whereas you can't walk around with Ebola for 2 or 3 days. So that's why you have these outbreaks in Marburg, Germany, or Uganda, but they don't last very long. I think of Al-Qaeda as kind of the Ebola virus of political groups. It's highly destructive, but it has a way of burning itself out. So as between an Iran and Hezbollah-supported Assad regime that I think can do very long-term harm, and these Al-Qaeda groups that are popping up here and there in Syria, on balance, in that sense, I'm pro-Al-Qaeda. Russia, right. Russia is a country that has an economy the size of Italy's. We are making a fundamental mistake. Helmut Schmidt, the late, not late. By the way, Helmut Schmidt, I'd just like to point out, is nearly 100 years old and smokes 3 packs of cigarettes a day. That's an aside for another time. Schmidt once described the Soviet Union as Upper Volta with nuclear weapons. And the description, I think, is still, I guess now you call it Burkina Faso with nuclear weapons. Russia's a weak country. It's a weak country whose entire economy depends heavily on its export of gas and oil, and to a lesser extent, other sorts of commodities. Russia has, in toto, 3 Nobel Prize winners. I mean, it's an astonishing thing when you think of what Russia was able to produce scientifically and technologically during the Cold War. Russia has 3 Nobel Prize winners. That's it. One of them is Mikhail Gorbachev. So they don't really, there's no intellectual property there. Anyone who's smart and Russian has left, and they're probably, living on the Upper East Side. So it's a weak and vulnerable country. A few things that could be done. Number one, as the United States begins to taper and as inflation, as interest rates go up, almost inevitably the price of energy and the price of other commodities will begin to fall. This is going to have a catastrophic effect on the Russian economy. The sooner we taper and the sooner interest rates begin to rise, the harder Russia will be hit. And it's unclear whether Russia can survive oil at less than $60 a barrel. It's not an accident, comrades, that Putin's rise and strength correlates very precisely with oil bottoming out in 1998 at $10 a barrel and then rising to northward of $140 a barrel just a few years ago. So the combination of higher interest rates and increased domestic supplies in the United States, or Western supplies, if you will, is going to hurt Putin. We can make it hurt more by bringing those supplies online faster and by doing everything we can to create an Atlantic energy economy. We could be exporting a tremendous amount of liquefied natural gas to the Europeans. They don't need to rely for their natural gas supplies so heavily. I think it's 30% of their supplies on Russians. You could also do things like restarting the Nabucco pipeline, bringing in oil from or gas from Azerbaijan into Europe. By the way, interestingly, since this is Tikvah, Israel will at one point be a very large part of that equation. There's Arthur Herman has a marvelous article in commentary. I don't know if it's this month or last month, but you should all read it. Israel's energy resources are astonishing, and they will play a part in this. Second thing is that not only is Russia a petrostate, it's an oligarchy, and the oligarchs love their access to the West. I mean, anyone who spends time in London, Londongrad, it's, Melanie Phillips thinks it's Londonistan, and then there are those of us who think it's Londongrad. It's actually both, which is just another reason why I love Britain. Britain's another country I don't like. Let's see how many people I can insult in the course of...
You're doing great.
Thank you. Bar their access to the West, and the administration kind of has the idea, and I hear that today they sanctioned a number of additional people, but starting out with 7 individuals, none of whom actually have assets in the West, was an astonishing display of fecklessness and indecision, and it was just incredible. A little bird once landed on my shoulder and told me that a very senior member of the Russian government, I have to be careful here, is worth a lot of money. I mean, a lot of money. Now, this little bird had a way of knowing this as a fact, and if he knew it, then it potentially could be publicized, and the funds could be tracked down, and they could be frozen and seized, and that would have, and you all have to kind of read between the lines here, that would have a tremendous way of focusing the mind of Russian leaders on what's really at stake in their gambits. We are not going to invade Crimea. We are not going to reverse what's happening in Crimea, but we can prevent Russia from taking over the north of Kazakhstan, which is heavily Russian, and Estonia, which is 30% Russian, and Latvia, which is about 25% Russian. And we should be very concerned about that because those are NATO member states where we have treaty obligations.
So are you concerned that those countries that have relied upon the American security umbrella for a number of years, who now see American retreat, if your argument is right, what is their strategy going to be? Well, are they going to adopt their own nuclear deterrence strategy? What are their lessons from the last couple of years of America, again, if your argument is right, being in retreat?
In addition now to being a great fan of Al-Qaeda, I'm a huge supporter of Saudi Arabia. One of the interesting phenomena is what I call the rise of the freelancers in my book. One of the great benefits of Pax Americana is that we have minimized the role of freelancers in foreign policy. Typically, when a country that relies on American security guarantees wants to do something in foreign policy, it consults with us first. Pax Americana has given the United States what you might call a right of first refusal on a whole number of issues. And this helps keep the peace. It helps settle our allies. It gives them a sense that they don't have to strike out on their own in risky gambits in order to assure their security. That is now visibly collapsing as Israel, as Saudi Arabia, as Japan, as Taiwan as the Gulf states start to rethink the fundamental sources of their security. The American insurance group, if you will, does not appear to be as reliable an institution as it once was. So if you're Saudi Arabia looking at American fecklessness with Iran, you're going to start thinking very seriously about your nuclear option. And in fact, we just had a visit at the Wall Street Journal from Prince Al-Walid bin Talal, one of the richest men in the world, who, to my astonishment, spoke openly about what he called this arrangement we have with Pakistan. Now, this arrangement we have with Pakistan is not a reference to pistachio exports. It's a reference to the fact that Saudi Arabia funded Pakistan's nuclear efforts, and there's an arrangement where some portion of Pakistan's nuclear deterrent is effectively a Saudi nuclear deterrent. It's just being parked offshore. About a year ago, there were reports that Pakistan was starting to produce more nuclear weapons. Well, what do they need all these nuclear weapons for? Well, my surmise, and I think I'm right, is that actually Pakistan was building Saudi nuclear weapons. They just happened to be located in Rawalpindi or wherever in Pakistan. Do we really want a world in which Saudi Arabia is forced to consider its own nuclear options? I would suggest that we do not. Do we want a world in which Israel is forced to go it alone, as I think it will go it alone, in a strike against Iran? Ideally, we do not. Iran is a global security threat, and it should be up to the world's only real superpower to deal with a global security threat. But we are inviting a much more disorderly world by tempting Israel into conducting a strike because Israel no longer has the confidence that the United States will, in the final analysis, conduct a strike of its own. It's very easy to sort of think through the effects of an American strike on Iran or the unintended consequences of that kind of strike, and all of those unintended consequences aren't so bad. Unintended consequences of an Israeli strike are much harder to think through and much more worrisome. I've come to the conclusion Israel should strike, but that's because I've lost faith in what I think would be the ideal conclusion to the crisis. The ideal realistic conclusion to the crisis. So we have freelancers all over the world. One last point I should make. I talk too long, I know. There are two kinds of unpredictability in the world. There's what I call subsystemic unpredictability, and there's systemic unpredictability. What's subsystemic unpredictability? Who will be the next president of the United States? Okay, Hillary Clinton. Who will be the president after her? I don't know. But we can be pretty sure that there will be an election in the year 2020, and a president will be elected. We don't know the name, but we know the mechanism, we know the position. Okay, so it's a low order of unpredictability. Okay, but the system we understand will almost certainly be in place. We're entering into a world that doesn't consist merely of subsystemic unpredictability, it's systemic unpredictability. What do I mean by systemic unpredictability? We don't know if Syria is going to exist in the year 2015 or 2016, and we don't know what's going to take its place. Syria is a state, it's a system, it's been there for the past 60 or 70 years as a given in the international order. Now that may dissolve entirely. Okay, so at the level of systems, it's becoming harder and harder to forecast what comes next. And the more unpredictability you inject into an international system, I think the more destabilized and violent it becomes.
So you mentioned in your opening comment the new isolationism of the right and of the left.
Yeah.
Well, in which side or in which pockets of American politics is there a serious debate? Meaning, is there a serious alternative to isolationism? Is it the liberal side, the conservative side, somewhere else? Where will an American resurgent disposition to the world come from, if anywhere?
Well, I think one of the real tragedies in American politics in the last 10 or 15 years has been the disappearance of what used to be known as the liberal internationalist school of foreign policy. These were people who thought that we needed to go into Iraq not for the sort of typical geopolitical reasons, WMD, instability, but because Saddam was an evil thug who killed lots of his own people and should be stopped. And this was a very respectable wing, intellectually respectable wing of the American foreign policy establishment. It had champions very much in the likes of members of the Clinton administration. I mean, after all, it was Clinton who did finally end the bloodshed in the Balkans. And I thought it had champions, at least a few of them, in the Obama administration with Samantha Power, but Power has been disempowered or something. I mean, I find it amazing. I find it amazing that the woman who wrote the book on genocide is just sort of sitting there at the UN and kind of thinking, I'm working for an administration that's allowing tens of thousands of people to be killed in Syria and doing nothing about it. She's a member of the very kind of, she's a part of the very kind of problem she swore she would be the solution to. And one day I'm sure we'll have an agonized, hand-wringing memoir about all this. So the disappearance of liberal internationalism in the Democratic Party, I think, is a very sad and tragic phenomenon. I don't know when it is going to reappear. You just don't hear liberal voices making the case for defending a liberal world order. Nowhere. You don't hear it. Peter Beinart, of all people, wrote this book a few years ago saying, that it was essentially a case for liberal hawkishness, and like everything else he's abandoned. That's another thing he's abandoned. Then on the Republican side, you still have a robust debate. And so I am hoping that there will be a Republican standard bearer who will be able to make a case that what a guy like Rand Paul advocates and thinks and believes is dangerous and vapid. I mean, I've been trying to follow Rand Paul's position on Ukraine, and there is no position. I mean, he's just sort of saying stuff. But this kind of insistent view that somehow the United States has bankrupted itself on foreign wars that we shouldn't have been involved in, that we've created this horrible security state where, the NSA is listening to your phone calls, Eric, because they're fascinating. It's preposterous and dangerous, and someone has to stand up to it because it's also demagogic. And I don't know who that candidate is. I mean, you've heard Ted Cruz say the other day, I don't agree with Rand Paul, which I don't like everything Ted Cruz says, but I thought that was right of him. Chris Christie was sounding those notes. He has his own foreign policy, New Jersey, New York issues. I don't know how fatal they are. I really don't. We'll see if there's a Republican standard bearer who emerges who can make a serious case for why the United States is the last best hope for an international order that we can live with.
So one more question for me, and then we'll open it up. Where does religion fit into this analysis? Certainly, if you look at Europe, it's arguably a post-religious civilization, and that is arguably central to its decline. You look at the Middle East, the role of Islam is obviously important, and religion remains important in America in defining who we are and what our sense of ourselves morally, politically, civilizationally, what that sense is. So as you analyze this from a foreign policy perspective, from a global analyst perspective, where does religion fit into the picture?
So in addition to being pro-Al-Qaeda and pro-Saudi Arabia, nice Jewish boy like me is very pro-Christian these days. And I note that the foreign policy leaders, or the leaders I admire the most, including, at least in terms of their foreign policy, including Tony Blair and George W. Bush, up to a point, had foreign policies that were deeply inflected with religious conviction. I don't know the answer to your question because I haven't really thought about it deeply. So having bloviated at great length on subjects I do know something about, I'm gonna hold off from attempting an answer. I guess let me make just 2 points, though. One is that we are foolish to imagine that Islam, I doubt anyone in this room imagines it, but we, the West, is foolish to imagine that the problems roiling the Middle East and our confrontation with Middle Eastern civilization isn't in some deep sense a confrontation with Islam and with a worldview that is very different from our own. And when I say Islam, I mean Islam today. I don't know what Islam was like in 1200 in the Alhambra, and I don't know what Islam will be like 800 years from now in some other. You deal with the religion you're presented with. And I think Tony Blair had a very interesting formulation, which he said, this idea that our problem is radical Islam isn't really wrong, because he said when you talk to moderate, so-called people who describe themselves as moderate Muslims, too often they go along with what radical Muslims believe, and they just don't, they don't make it actionable, so to speak. And that's a tragic thing to say, but the fact is there's a lot of validity to what he's saying. I don't know how you go about reforming Islamic theology institutions. I think this is a civilization that will take its own long, long time to have some kind of confrontation with what it has become or is becoming. The second point I would make is that ultimately, confidence in the West has to be based on something more than notions of sort of instrumental rationality or prosperity or something. I mean, there has to be some higher purpose to what the West is all about. I just wrote this little editorial that I was very pleased with about this discovery about inflation in the universe. The standard model in astronomy seems to have been confirmed by findings of radio astronomers working out of the South Pole. And the way I concluded the editorial is to say that the task of us, these findings come about through a culture that prizes experiment and empiricism and freedom of inquiry. And the task for those of us who aren't peering into the heavens is to make a world that's safe for those who are peering into the heavens. I don't know if that's a religious task, but it's a kind of a civilizational task. When we think about our confrontation with various sources of illiberalism, what are the deep sources of our own confidence in our civilization? One of them certainly has to be religion, and one of them has to be Jerusalem, or if you will, and the other has to be Athens. And I'm not sure we're doing an adequate job of it. Let me just give you one example of what I mean. I'm fascinated by this debate about the burqa in the West. Because there are two sort of liberal positions one can take about the veiling of women. Actually, there are many positions, but among the liberal positions, one is your clothing is a choice, and it's an individual choice. And what is the West all about? It's about allowing individuals to make those kinds of choices about whether they want to be veiled or unveiled, how they want to dress, so forth and so on. And so this is a kind of a libertarian argument is made for wearing the niqab or the veil. I think that's a kind of a shallow argument, because ultimately liberalism and a liberal public order requires us to be seen, to be faces in the public square, that the right through which we claim representation means showing ourselves. This is who I am. And we are doing a disservice to the deep sources of liberal order by pretending that we can be a liberal society in which we all live behind, or many of us live behind, in effect, a one-way mirror where one person can see out but you can't see back. Your face is intrinsic to your humanity. Your face is the mechanism by which you communicate 50%, if not more, of your meaning. And a form of liberalism or libertarianism that ignores that is really, I think, ignoring some deep philosophical basis for why we are in the kind of society we're in which we have rights but responsibilities, in which we're accountable, in which we are people, we are persons. So leaving aside religion, unless there's kind of some deep articulation of what it is that we're doing as a civilization, I think we're going to be in a lot of trouble. It's very hard to make the case against Islam by saying we're more prosperous, we're richer. You know, Islam is making a virtue-based case for the claims it makes. You know, as Ayatollah Khomeini says, you know, I didn't have an Islamic revolution to cut the price of lemons or melons or something like that. It wasn't to say I didn't do this to make it a richer country. I made it because I believe in Islamic virtue. And this is what the revolution is about. There's a reason why all the Islamist parties talk about themselves as the justice parties. In Turkey, it's the Justice and Development Party. In Egypt, it's the Justice and Freedom Party, and so forth and so on. Well, they're making a kind of a claim for a virtue-based politics. How do you make a counterclaim for a freedom-based politics that isn't also devoid of any sense of virtue or higher purpose? Now, this is a kind of a deep problem in Western civilization. I mean, the kind of confrontation between ancients and moderns. And you have, in fact, in Locke and Rousseau and John Stuart Mill, various liberal thinkers, you have a deep explanation for why free societies are ultimately also better societies and indeed more virtuous societies. But it's hard to make that case, right, when you have no sense of what these guys are saying and what it all means. You know, we're free. Well, what does that mean? Freedom to what? Freedom to be a porn star at Duke University? It's a hard case to make. So what is... I've gone way afield of your question.
Okay, let's open it up. Sir.
Mark Krause again. I've lived in New York all my life, a lot of family in Israel, so I am biased. I've heard many times Israel is the canary in the coal mine vis-a-vis terrorism, Islamic fundamentalism. They're surrounded. How in this country do we not see that if you change your borders as a lesson, all you end up doing is making it easier and moving missiles closer? If we retreat as a country here in the United States, how is it that our leaders don't see that you just make it easier for the bombings and you make it easier, as you say, the small incidents that chip away at civilization?
Well, in a way, I'd rather not answer your question. How do they not see it? I don't know. I wish they saw. They don't read my column. I mean, I've been writing the same column over and over again, clearly not reading it. But I want to just touch briefly on your first point about Israel retreating and thinking it's purchasing some measure of security by its retreat. And that's a perfect example because, you know, in fact, Israel retreated from Gaza, and what it got was... The issue isn't the missiles. The issue isn't the Qassams are a couple of kilometers closer. The issue is the credibility of Israeli deterrence and the sense that if you push the Israelis hard enough and you kill enough of them and you make life sufficiently unpleasant for them, at some point they are going to step back. And as Napoleon once said, the logical outcome of retreat is surrender. Napoleon is said to have said that. Lots of things are said. I'd like to think Napoleon said it because it's a great line. It's true. You end up exactly. You end up in St. Helena. There's also something. Henry Kissinger once had a wonderful line about retreat from Vietnam. And he said it's like salted peanuts. You know, if you eat a single salted peanut from a packet on an airliner, you are going to eat the whole packet. I assure you there is not a person here who has ever left half a packet of salted peanuts on the plane. And so once you embark on the process of retreat, it's hard to know where to stop. You know, Obama was saying Iraq is the bad war and Afghanistan is the good war. And I'm going to fight Iraq, I'm going to get out of Iraq so I can concentrate on Afghanistan. But like salted peanuts, predictably, the moment we got out of Iraq, the impetus to get out of Afghanistan became overwhelming. You know, once you start saying, well, we can live with a nuclear Iran, we will soon be saying to ourselves, we're going to live with a nuclear Saudi Arabia and a nuclear Turkey. Turkey, by the way, just signed a nuclear cooperation agreement with Japan that allows it to enrich uranium and reprocess plutonium. Small detail. Turkey's such a nice country these days, too. So you have to be mindful that there's no such thing as being a little bit pregnant. There's no such thing as a little bit of inflation, and perhaps there's no such thing as a little bit of retreat. Once you embark on the process, the tendency is to go all the way, and that's dangerous.
Ma'am in the front.
It's nice to see a real journalist. I just feel that right now there's not a lot of actual news journalism going on. What do you see in your profession? How does it make you feel looking around at what's going on? Aren't they just enablers in this sort of like perpetual disaster that is every day, getting up and reading the news, and yet somehow there's not enough actual journalists just dissecting it and dissenting? And is there actual free speech going on, in your opinion, and can we survive the next 3 years?
I think we will survive the next 3 years. Because we've survived worse, but we are, the trends are not good and they're accelerating, let's put it that way. And if, I mean, who would have imagined a year ago that Russia would take the Crimea just like that? Well, there it is. They just did it. So it's a good, I mean, we'll see what happens over the next 3 years, but my forecast is that if we continue to allow this to happen, we are going to be living in a world in which, quote, unthinkable things are going to become commonplaces. That's very worrying. Secondly, as to my profession, media is a plural noun, and I think, at least where I sit at the Wall Street Journal, we produce a pretty magnificent newspaper. There's a superb music critic at the New York Times. I'm married to her. When you say journalism, there are a number of angles or aspects to it.
Can I just have a follow-up?
Yeah, go ahead.
For instance, today on Drudge, there was a mentioning that the White House press corps is giving over questions, getting the answers, that there's a possibility that it's all staged.
Mm-hmm.
It's just yet another example of a lack of dissent. And this is what is allowing for for the administration to do what it wants to do, and at the same time not do anything foreign policy-wise, making us weaker and weaker. And I'm just wondering, you say sort of like, okay, well, Hillary Clinton will be the next president. How is that not decline? I mean, it's not just extreme. But
Actually, I think it would be an improvement over the current president, but
I'm just trying to understand how it's not decline.
well, look, but let me address that, because I actually think that the worst period of American journalism was probably the 1970s and 1980s, where the three big, ABC, CBS, and NBC, had an effective monopoly, I guess CNN, and they all thought exactly the same thing, and they were all powerful. And what Walter Cronkite said literally changed the course of a nation. I mean, Walter Cronkite, he should have been called Walter Crankite, because after he retired, and he gave a sense of his views, they were incredibly extreme and frankly disturbing. I mean, he liked the space program. On that, we agreed. But other than that, no. And it was a disturbing period in American history when a guy like Walter Cronkite, or then Dan Rather, these sort of mediocre intellects who assumed the anchor's chair and were able to kind of manipulate the news, not only according to their ideology, but within the confines of their very limited intelligence. That was actually a terrifying period in history. Now you have, I mean, look, what's the news? I was just looking at the ratings for O'Reilly versus Rachel Maddow, or, I never watch any of them. But we live in a world where you just said the Drudge Report. There's the Drudge Report. There's Fox News, Wall Street Journal, Weekly Standard. There's a proliferation of media. And frankly, if you're of my persuasion, many more alternatives today than there were 20 years. I mean, 20 years ago, if you were a conservative, you read Commentary Magazine and the editorial page of the Wall Street Journal, and I guess the New York Post, if you were lucky enough to live on the Upper East Side, and that was kind of it. And then you talked about the liberal media, and that was actually a perfectly valid thing to say. It was a liberal media. I think it's less valid today. I mean, just the example you said, I don't know if it's true or not, but the fact is, not only is it true, maybe it's true, but the interesting point is that if it is true, it was exposed. And I find that more important in effect than whether he was prepping his questions.
Sir.
Okay, thank you. Ruben Kryam from Covington and Burling, Dean Atchison's old firm. If I could ask you to expand on two things that you said. One was...
Speak up.
Okay, one was you said you would recommend, or you have come to think that, and maybe two things don't mean the same thing. You've come to think that Israel will act unilaterally on Iran. Mm-hmm. Expand on that. The other, that is, why, and do you think that is in fact a good idea? The second question I have is, you said something at the start of your talk quite provocatively about Europe, and you said it will only get worse and there will eventually be a civilizational catastrophe. What do you have in mind? What sort of thing are you talking about?
Okay. There is 50% youth unemployment in Italy, Spain, Greece. Those are the sort of social conditions that lead to fascism. And by the way, it should lead to fascism, because if you go to Bologna University and you have a degree and you have nothing to show for it, and you're washing dishes, or you're shoveling groceries, or picking food out of garbage cans, as hundreds of thousands of educated young Spaniards and Italians and Greeks are doing, you're going to stage a revolution. At some point, you will not remain placid. You won't just sit there with your mother eating ravioli or whatever. So these are conditions that are ripe for a new kind of, on the right, fascist, on the left, ultra-leftist politics. I mean, in the end, they're basically the same thing. And they explain why the neo-Nazi Golden Dawn Party pulled so well in Greece, why you're seeing the breakdown of the traditional parties in Italy, and a new proliferation of a variety of parties. We'll see how their new prime minister does. Why Marine Le Pen did so well in the French election last time, and she'll do much better, by the way, this time around. And they will have natural constituencies of young people who don't understand what the hell went wrong and are furious. Part of the problem, too, in Europe is that, and one of the reasons why it's different from the United States, is that in the United States there are two parties, and in my humble opinion, one of them is usually wrong and the other of them is usually right, okay? Usually taken broadly, okay? But there is it's funny, there's this kind of caricature of the United States that somehow we have diminished intellectual resources. I actually look at the United States, you look at all the policy think tanks, and they're just productive, energetic places, people really thinking about political challenges constantly, whether it's American Enterprise Institute or, all these Washington Institutes, really kind of there's this intellectual ferment taking place in Washington at the policy level and also at the political level, which means that when policymakers look at the menu of available policies, not all of them consist of half-cooked chicken, For Europe, for decades, the sort of, the policy debate has been a stagnant policy debate between two sides that are basically on the wrong side of things, no matter how you look. You have, this funny debate between austerity and, quote, growth. Growth means more government spending. This was François Hollande's program. Now, 57% of French GDP is from the state sector. 57%, okay? This is communism, practically. Goulash communism. It's an astonishing number for a Western country, that 57% of their GDP is the state, okay? Now, this was the growth remedy. On the other side, the austerity remedy is, we need to balance our books, so we're going to jack up taxes beyond, their already astronomical levels and squelch economic growth for the sake of balancing our books. Well, neither side in that debate is providing a useful answer and is explaining why Europe keeps digging itself into a crisis. Another problem that the Europeans have is they say, oh, there's some problem. What we need is more Europe. You hear like perfectly smart people in Brussels say, well, the answer is more Europe. Well, what does that mean? More Europe. More Europe just means another functionary in Brussels issuing another regulation on how electronic waste needs to be disposed of in 17 garbages as opposed to 18 garbages, or something like, or whatever. This is the kind of debate. These are the kind of policy debates you have in Europe, and it's a stagnant debate. There is no constituency really in Europe that's saying, you know what, we need policies that emphasize low taxes, that make life easier for entrepreneurs, that understand that in a world where people are living to 80, you can't just retire at 60. These sorts of things, these are all considered savage capitalists and Anglo-Saxon neoliberals in Europe. And there are like 10 of these people, and I know all of them, okay? There's like Guy Sorman in France, and there's like one guy in Germany, and like, 2 other people in Italy. That's it. So it's a civilization that is devoid of the intellectual constituencies you need to produce intelligent, winning policy options. This is a profound problem that Europe has, much more profound than what the euro does, or what Trichet's monetary policies. Now, to your first question about Israel. So Israel is a small country with limited means, and if it undertakes a strike on Iran, it is not going to look like Osirak in 1981 or the strike on Syria in 2007. It's over before you knew it began. It will be a major undertaking, and a very risky undertaking, where it becomes increasingly difficult to imagine what happens on day 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5, right? The imponderables grow. That said, I favor it because despite all of that risk, which would be unnecessary if the United States were serious about its global responsibilities, despite all of that risk, nothing is so potentially catastrophic to Israel's existence as Iran with a nuclear weapon. So it is, an Iran with a nuclear weapon is this, as Michael Walzer would say, was here a year ago when I debated him, it's the supreme emergency. It's where you have to remove all the stops. Israel simply cannot allow it, and I think Israelis understand that they simply cannot allow it, and they understand also that the United States is prepared to allow it. That's why I think they will strike. But no one should be under the impression that this is going to be in any way easy on Israel. I think you should think of it as 1973, the worst war in Israel's history, but it's a good thing they won it.
What's the worst case scenario of an Israeli strike?
Worst case scenario of an Israeli strike is a massive ballistic missile attack by Iran and Hezbollah on Israel that, among other things, destroys the Dimona nuclear reactor, the power plant in Hadera, other critical pieces of Israeli infrastructure, inflicts mass casualties, not on the order of 40, 50, but hundreds, if not thousands of people, and which, by the way, and I guess another aspect is a strike where Israel doesn't actually succeed in substantially degrading Iran's capabilities.
Orna Schulman, attorney, entrepreneur, private investor, now thinker about the Jewish nation or people. I want to ask you a question about parallels that you might see with the Jewish establishment through the 20th century, whether it's beginnings of Zionism and Jabotinsky and the socialist bent through the 1940s with Stephen Weiss, and what's going on today with AIPAC and other things that are making enough references for you to pick up on. Is the Jewish establishment in a place of denial, or go with don't rock the boat, or is the liberal bias just overwhelming?
It's a good question. I mean, I don't know how. I mean, I think about the Jews. I don't spend a lot of time thinking about the Jewish establishment, so to speak. I mean, I'm not seized with what happens after Abe Foxman. The fears about what happens after Abe retires or something like that. Instead of answering the question, let me answer the question I want to answer. as Jews have acquired power in the United States, economic and political and social power, I think they need to be mindful that there are occasions when the use of power or the purposes of the power which they have acquired, is not to be on the side of power. It is to exercise power in pursuit of their views. And what I fear is a Jewish establishment that just wants to be on the good side of almost anyone who happens to be in the Oval Office. I mean, there is more to life than getting invited to the White House Hanukkah party so you can, light the menorah with Mrs. Obama or whatever and then have a picture in your office. For what? And look, more specifically, I'm going to leave it at that. I'm going to leave it at that. But you just it's important because look, I mean, my standard joke is thank God I was born a Jew because otherwise I'd be a raging anti-Semite. Because I tear my hair out all the time at my fellow Jews. But rare is it in history that we've been blessed to live in a country where we can say anything we want and actually get away with it. And it is a scandal, it seems to me, if we fail to live up to the promise of our American citizenship to do all we can to assure the survival of the Jewish state and the Jewish people. So that's what I'd say. Yeah, there's more I could say, but I won't.
Sir, over here.
There's one thing that I don't understand about the Ukraine situation, and maybe you can help me out. There's been a lot of talk about Putin taking over Crimea, and very little talk about the fact that Crimea was ceded to Ukraine in 1954 by the Soviet Union. I have no idea why that happened, and maybe you have some idea why it did.
Yeah, it was a maneuver. It wasn't even Khrushchev who did it, I think, because Khrushchev only came to power in about 55, 56. It was Georgy Malenkov, for those of you who... it was signed by... Oh, okay, so there you go. So it was not even, although Khrushchev was Ukrainian. People bring this up, and it was internal Soviet politics. I'm not exactly sure what the purpose of it is. But I would reply by saying it's an irrelevant consideration what happened in Eric didn't mention that I grew up in Mexico City, and I have very strong feelings about the Treaty of Guadalupe. And I have not yet ceded Colorado or New Mexico to you gringos at all. And it's all mine. Not only is there a historic Mexican claim, there's a historic Jewish Mexican claim to that area, and I'd like to assert it. I mean, the point is, if you end up sort of saying, well, there was some historic claim, there's no end to this kind of game that you can play, and it's a dangerous way to go. The fact is, there was a sovereign country whose borders were recognized and internationally guaranteed, and that sovereignty was violated. And by the way, all of Crimea is not Russia. I was just in Crimea a few months ago. Okay, I was in Simferopol and Yalta. It's about 60% ethnic Russian. Okay, not 100. So it means that the vote that they had, where 97% of the people voted, was a classic Stalinist style election. And even if it were the case that a majority of Crimeans wanted to secede from Ukraine, it doesn't make it legitimate. A majority of South Carolinians wanted to secede from the United States, and we had a view on that, and that issue had been settled. So, ultimately, the ultimate claim to Crimea, by the way, is Turkish, since the Russians seized it from the Turks. And by the way, if you go to Crimea, you'll see many mosques up and down the road between Simferopol and Yalta.
So I'll take the privilege of the last question. How would you assess the political leadership and political will of Israel? And you've had much to say about the state of America's state of mind, its attitudes toward the world, its cultural will, the debates within it. As you look at Israel, what do you see?
You know, it's funny about Israel. You always feel despondent about the country until you actually show up in it. And then it's hard not to feel good about it at all levels, from, you know, sexy waitresses on up. The whole place just exudes marvelousness. Now, about the political leadership, I was thinking about the waitresses. Anyway, so I was in a reverie thinking about this one waitress in this restaurant in Ashkelon.
All right, I'm cutting
Anyway,
this one off.
no, I'll answer the question.
This is a serious question.
I know. So look, in Israel, there is very little room for fantasy-based politics. You can't get away with bullshit. America is a land where 90% of politics is bullshit. The things that we debate are bullshit. The issues over which voters are mobilized are bullshit, okay? I mean, if you are a woman in America, you can rest assured that your right and access to contraception will never, ever, ever, ever be denied, okay? And yet voters are mobilized on the theory that if you vote Republican, there is going to be an army of anti-abortionists in FBI uniforms preventing you from access to contraception. You think, well, what planet are you from? Or Rand Paul going around talking about the NSA. I mean, this is a guy who's deliberately trafficking on American stupidity, okay, to say that, like, the fact that we have metadata searches, which is telephone numbers, means we're actually listening in on your conversation. And all too many people in this country, like, go for this because maybe it makes seem like our very mundane, boring politics makes it seem more dramatic and consequential than it is. So the margin between American policy and what you would call consequences is several thousand miles. And in a way, that's a great achievement, but it's also a great danger. One of the kind of benefits of Pax Americana is that we've forgotten what a disordered world looks like. And so we're like, oh, you know, yeah, Ukraine, wherever, you know, whatever, dude. And you're like, yeah, Ukraine. And so you have to have, like, you need already such a level of education just to get to the point where, A, you know where Ukraine is, right, or who Vladimir Putin is, what he's done. I mean, you're asking a lot of Americans to say, like, stop watching Lena Dunham and worry about Ukraine. I mean, the President of the United States, okay, Ukraine, it's collapsing. What should I do? I'm going to talk to Zach Galifianakis and Ryan Seacrest about whether I wear loose jeans or tight jeans. I mean, this is... You know, well, it's Daniel Patrick.
Bring this back to Israel.
Yeah, I will. Daniel Patrick Moynihan had this line about defining deviancy down. And when you live in a world where the distance between policy and consequences is a long distance, you define deviancy down because you can kind of screw up a long way before you actually meet with reality. In Italy, that margin is about in Israel, that margin is, well, in Italy, that's another story. That margin is literally never more than about 40 miles or so. It's the distance from any person in Israel to a hostile border where they would be killed the moment they cross that border. So it creates, whatever you say about the caliber of Israeli leaders, it creates leaders who have no choice but to be deeply rooted in tachlis, in reality. And so that tends to produce higher caliber leaders by and large. And you meet Israelis and you always have the refreshing sense that you are truly in the no spin zone. Even when you disagree with them, they are operating on a plane that just is more in tune with reality. That being said, there are a couple of major problems in Israeli politics. One of them is a cultural problem, which is the Israeli habit of mouthing off. And much as I completely agree with what Yalon just said, okay, it is incomprehensible to me that the guy has forgotten that he's the defense minister, and he's going to say this, and for sure he's going to have to go and offer some groveling and embarrassing apology to Chuck Hagel of all people. It is a stupid thing. And why is it that Yalon, Meir Dagan, all these guys who in many ways are very capable people, right? They're always just spouting. And someone should say, well, you need to say that the Jewish people need to be taught the virtues of occasionally shutting up, okay?
You've mastered this art?
That's the best line of the night. The second thing I would say is this, which is Israelis tend to think a little too tactically. And they tend to treat almost every political problem as a tactical operation. And they forget what the deep sources of Jewish and Israeli strength are. And you see this all, I guess in a small way, in the way they're sort of almost overthinking Iran and the, sort of the cost-benefit ratio of an attack on Iran. But it also goes to the way in which Israelis think about Israel generally. And I'll close with this, I swear to God. Israel should not expect that it will be loved for its goodness or its beneficence, or for the fact that Syrian kids are being treated in Israeli hospitals, or for the fact that Israel has made this and that concession for peace and ceded more territory than any other country on earth as a percentage of its overall territory. Israel will never be loved because of conspicuous acts of magnanimity. Okay, Israel will only be loved because it's respected. The only people who like it, no one says, "Oh, I love Israel because they took risks for peace." People who say, "You took risks for peace." Well, why aren't you taking more risks for peace? Why aren't you annihilating yourself on the road to peace? Because these are people who love Jews when they're in Auschwitz or on the verge of going to Auschwitz. Because then they imagine they're gonna be like the Swedish diplomat. They're gonna be saving them, handing them passports, and they'll be magnificent to the Jews who are pathetic. This is the people who like Israel, okay, are the people who say, God damn it, the Israelis are the guys who are going to take care of business when all is said and done. And that's important to remember. There's a lot of philo-Semitism in the world, but that philo-Semitism comes from people who respect Israeli strength. Okay, I was at an AIPAC speech not so long ago, and there was this panel before I spoke. I'm like, oh my God, there has to be a panel before I speak. What are these people wasting their time for? I could be speaking for 2 hours as opposed to 1 hour. So, to my astonishment, okay, it was a very interesting panel, and they were all Christian lay leaders describing what it is that they like about Israel. And one of them was saying, one guy said, I like Israel because it's a country that gets things done, that acts, that is courageous. And another person, a Christian pastor, who said, the land was promised to Israel. Therefore, I'm for it. That's a consideration, by the way, when Israel considers the cost-benefit analysis of giving up ceding land for so-called peace, remembering that one of the reasons why millions of Americans love Israel is because it has the land, not because it's prepared to give it up. That's something to think about. Israel will not do well. Israel will not do well in the world if it has to throw itself at the world's mercy. Israel will only do well in the world if it earns, by dint of courage and wit and nerve, the world's respect.
Bret, on that note, we thank you, and thanks to everyone for joining us this evening.
That was brilliant.